Should we keep fighting in Iran? That's the question most people are asking right now. War or peace, strength or negotiation, staying or leaving? It sounds like a foreign policy debate. Something for generals and senators to argue about in Washington. Not something that affects your grocery bill, your heating costs, your doctor's visits. But here's what that question leaves out. War is not free. Every missile costs money, every deployment costs money, and every day of combat operations costs money. And that money comes from somewhere. On April 3, 2026, the White House released its proposed budget for 2027. Defense spending, $1.5 trillion. A 40% increase over last year. The largest military budget expansion since World War II. And to pay for it, welfare spending cut by 10%. Low-income heating assistance eliminated entirely. 17 education programs consolidated or cut. Small business support reduced. Medicare under pressure. So the real question isn't war or peace. The real question is this. Do you want your Medicare spent on missiles or on hospitals? Do you want your heating assistance cut so another fighter jet can fly? Do you want your child's education program eliminated so another missile can be built? This isn't a foreign policy debate anymore. This is your money, your life, and your choice. And right now, that choice has already been made for you. The question is whether you know it. Let's take the first door seriously. Because there's a real argument here, not a political one, a practical one. The argument goes like this. Iran has been a problem for 40 years. Not a small problem, not a manageable problem, a persistent, escalating generational problem. Nuclear ambitions, proxy militias across the Middle East, repeated threats to close the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which 20% of the world's oil supply moves every single day. Every previous administration tried a different approach. Sanctions, negotiations, deals, airstrikes, proxy conflicts. None of it worked. And now there's a war happening, bombs already falling, soldiers already deployed, 15 Americans already dead. The argument for door A says, if you're already in it, finish it. Don't stop halfway, don't negotiate from weakness, don't let Iran survive this and rebuild stronger. Go all the way, destroy the nuclear facilities, break the missile program, secure the Strait of Hormuz permanently. End it now so it stays ended. And here's where it connects to your daily life. Right now, gas is over $4 a gallon. Every time tensions spike in the Middle East, oil markets panic and prices jump. Every time there's news of another attack near the Strait of Hormuz, the price at the pump goes up the next morning. If the war ends decisively, that stops. Oil markets stabilize, the strait stays open, supply flows freely, gas prices come down. For the truck driver doing 600 miles a week, that's hundreds of dollars a month back in their pocket. For the small business owner paying delivery surcharges on every order, that's real margin restored. For the family doing a 40-mile round-trip commute every day, that's a bill that finally stops climbing. And beyond the gas prices, there's a longer argument. If Iran is neutralized now, genuinely and permanently, the next 20 to 30 years look different. No more proxy wars bleeding American resources. No more troops rotating through the Middle East on permanent standby. No more military families wondering if their son or daughter is about to get deployed again. Your grandchildren don't fight this war. That's the promise of door A. Spend now, sacrifice now, cut the welfare programs now. And buy a future where this problem is gone. The core message, pay the price today, and tomorrow gets easier. But let's look at what's actually in the bill. Not the headlines, not the press release, the actual numbers. $1.5 trillion in defense spending has to come from somewhere, and the budget shows exactly where. Low-income heating and cooling assistance, $4 billion, gone entirely, not reduced, eliminated. That program helped 6.7 million households last winter, mostly elderly people on fixed incomes, single parents in cold weather states, disabled adults who can't work, people who weren't choosing between heating and groceries as a metaphor. They were doing it literally every month. This winter, that check doesn't come. 17 federal education programs, consolidated or eliminated, after-school programs in low-income neighborhoods, adult literacy programs for workers trying to retrain, vocational training for people displaced from manufacturing jobs, the programs that existed specifically because the private market wasn't serving those people. Gone. Small business lending support, reduced. The programs that helped someone open a second location, buy new equipment without going to a predatory lender, survive a slow quarter without laying off their 2 employees. Reduced. And then there's Medicare. The current budget doesn't show a direct Medicare cut, not yet, but here's the math that doesn't appear in the headline. When you cut welfare spending by 10% across the board and defense spending goes up by 40%, the pressure on the remaining budget grows every year. The deficit grows, the debt grows, the interest payments on that debt grow. And eventually, the pressure lands somewhere. It always lands somewhere. The 2 largest items in the discretionary budget are defense and healthcare. If defense is untouchable and the deficit keeps climbing, healthcare becomes the place where the cuts eventually go. Not this year, maybe not next year. But the direction is set. And in the meantime, the cuts that are already happening aren't abstract. Think about what $4 billion in heating assistance actually means in a single winter. A 74-year-old woman in Minnesota, fixed income, Social Security check covers rent and food barely. The heating assistance covered the gap between what her furnace cost and what she could afford. Without it, she faces a choice. Heat the house and don't eat properly. Eat properly and keep the thermostat at 58 degrees. That's not a policy position, that's a person. A single mother in Ohio, 2 kids, works 30 hours a week because that's what the school schedule allows. The after-school program meant her kids were safe and supervised while she worked. That program just got cut. Now she either pays for private childcare she can't afford, or she reduces her hours, or she leaves her kids unsupervised. Again, not a statistic, a person. A 58-year-old factory worker in Michigan, plant moved to Mexico 3 years ago, has been in a federal retraining program learning HVAC installation, 6 months from certification. The program gets consolidated, funding redirected. He starts over, or stops. These are the people paying for the war. Not with their votes, not with their opinions. With their heating, their children's programs, their retraining opportunities, their healthcare trajectory. The fighter jets are real, the missile strikes are real, the security gains might be real. But the cost is also real. And it's not coming out of the defense contractor's budget. It's coming out of theirs. Now let's take the second door seriously. Because this argument is just as real. The argument goes like this. The war in Iran is 1 month old. A ceasefire was just announced. Negotiations are starting in Islamabad. There is a window right now to stop. Not retreat, not surrender, stop. Declare a pause, protect what's already been gained, pull back from full-scale war before the costs compound further. And redirect the monies. If the defense budget increase gets rolled back, even partially, the welfare cuts don't have to happen. The heating assistance stays, the education programs stay, the small business lending stays, the Medicare trajectory changes. 6.7 million households keep their heating assistance this winter. 17 education programs keep running. Millions of small business owners keep their access to affordable lending. And the 65 million Americans on Medicare stop watching the long-term budget math move in the wrong direction. That's not an abstract policy outcome. That's 65 million people who go to sleep not worrying about whether their coverage will be there next year. But it goes further than the numbers. When the war scales down, soldiers come home. The families who have been living with deployment notices and casualty reports and middle-of-the-night phone calls get to breathe again. That's not a budget line. That's a human cost that doesn't appear in any spreadsheet. And the economy starts moving differently. Right now, businesses are frozen, not collapsing, but not growing. Investment decisions are being delayed. Hiring is cautious. The reason isn't complicated. Nobody expands aggressively when they don't know if oil is going to be $4 a gallon or $7 a gallon next quarter. Nobody takes on new debt when interest rates are elevated by war financing. When the war scales back, that uncertainty starts to lift, not immediately, not completely, but directionally. Oil markets stabilize, not because Iran has been defeated, but because the immediate threat to the Strait of Hormuz is reduced. Prices ease. The supply chain pressure that has been feeding inflation for 6 weeks starts to release. Interest rates have room to come down, not overnight, but the bond market pressure that drove your credit card from 19.9% to 22.4% starts to ease. Refinancing becomes possible again, borrowing costs less. Small businesses start investing again, hiring resumes, wages start moving. And beyond all of that, there's a structural argument that doesn't get talked about enough. Every major American military engagement in the last 30 years has followed the same pattern. It starts with a clear objective, a specific target, a defined mission. And then it expands. Iraq was supposed to be weeks, it was years. Afghanistan was supposed to be targeted, it became a generation. The logic of escalation doesn't come from bad intentions, it comes from the nature of unfinished conflicts. Every partial victory creates a new vulnerability. Every withdrawal creates a power vacuum. Every ceasefire that doesn't hold requires another deployment. If the Iran war follows that pattern, the $1.5 trillion budget isn't the ceiling, it's the floor. Door B says, get out before the pattern locks in. Stop while there's still a ceasefire to hold. Stop while negotiations are still possible. Stop before the next phase requires another 40% budget increase on top of this one. Because if that happens, the question won't be Medicare versus missiles. It'll be Medicare versus missiles versus the next war after that. The core message, protect what you have now and stop the cycle before it compounds. But let's be honest about what stopping actually means. Because Door B has a bill too. And it's worth looking at directly. Iran's nuclear program is still intact. The strikes hit military infrastructure, command centers, missile facilities, air defense systems, but the deep underground nuclear enrichment sites, the ones built specifically to survive airstrikes, are still operating. The knowledge doesn't go away, the scientists don't leave, the program pauses maybe, but it doesn't end. If the war stops now, Iran rebuilds. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, but the trajectory doesn't change. A country that was 6 months from a nuclear weapon before the war started is still a country that wants a nuclear weapon. The motivation didn't get bombed away. And that means the problem gets handed to the next administration, and the one after that, until eventually someone faces a version of this choice again, except with a nuclear-armed Iran at the table. That's not a scare story. That's the straight line from where we are now to where we end up if the war stops without a resolution. Then there's the Strait of Hormuz. Right now it's partially reopened as part of the ceasefire terms, but it's fragile. Iran still has the capability to close it. The mines are still in Iranian waters. The missile batteries that threaten tanker traffic are damaged but not destroyed. If negotiations collapse, and history suggests they often do, the strait closes again. Oil goes back to $5 a gallon, maybe higher. And here's the part that doesn't get said clearly enough. The military doesn't just disappear when a war scales back. The troops stationed in the region stay stationed in the region, because you can't just pull everyone out and hope nothing happens. The bases remain open, the carrier groups remain deployed, the logistics chains keep running. That costs money, not $1.5 trillion a year, but not zero either. The ongoing cost of maintaining a significant military presence in the Middle East, even without active combat, runs to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. That money still comes from somewhere. The budget pressure doesn't fully release just because the bombing stops. And then there's the credibility question. This is the argument that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it's real. When the United States starts a military campaign and then stops short of its objectives, it sends a signal, not just to Iran, to every government watching. That signal says, if you can hold out long enough, absorb the initial strikes, and wait for domestic opposition to build, America will eventually pull back. That signal has consequences, not immediately, not in ways that show up on a grocery receipt, but over years and decades, it shapes how other countries calculate their own decisions about weapons programs, regional aggression, and negotiations with the United States. Door B says protect your Medicare and your heating bill today. But it doesn't make those long-term risks disappear. It defers them. And deferred risks have a way of coming back larger than they left. The 58-year-old factory worker who kept his retraining program under Door B still lives in a world where, 10 years from now, a nuclear-armed Iran triggers another crisis. The 74-year-old woman in Minnesota who kept her heating assistance under Door B still lives in a world where oil prices are one regional incident away from spiking again. Door B protects them today. It doesn't protect them from everything that comes after. The core message, stopping feels like relief, but unresolved problems don't stay unresolved quietly. So here's where we actually are. Not in the headlines, not in the debate, in the real structure of the choice. Two doors, both of them cost something, neither of them is free. That's the part that gets lost in every conversation about this war. People who support Dora talk about security and resolve and finishing what was started. They're not wrong about the risks of stopping. People who support Door B talk about lives and livelihoods and the cost of endless war. They're not wrong about the burden falling on ordinary people. Both sides are describing something real, but they're describing different parts of the same problem. Here's the actual structure. Door A says pay now and living costs, buy security later. You cut the heating assistance today, you eliminate the education programs today, you put Medicare under pressure today, and in exchange, you get a Middle East that stops generating crises for the next generation. You get oil at $2.50 a gallon again. You get your grandchildren not fighting this war. That's the trade, living costs now, security later. Door B says, protect living costs now, carry security risk later. You keep the heating assistance, you keep the education programs, you keep Medicare stable, and in exchange, you carry the risk that Iran rebuilds, that the Strait of Hormuz stays fragile, that oil prices remain volatile, that in 10 or 15 years this whole thing starts again at a higher level of danger. That's the trade, life stability now, risk later. Neither trade is obviously wrong. That's what makes this genuinely hard. And here's the thing that both sides don't say clearly. This isn't a question about war. It's a question about timing. The costs of this conflict are going to be paid, one way or another, by someone at some point. The only real variable is when. Door A pays now, in heating bills and education programs and Medicare pressure, in the lives of soldiers currently deployed, in the economic disruption of a wartime budget. Door B pays later, in a rebuilt Iranian nuclear program, in future oil price spikes, in the next administration's version of this exact crisis, except harder and more expensive. Neither door lets you avoid the cost. They just schedule it differently. And that scheduling decision lands differently depending on who you are. If you're 74 years old and on a fixed income, Door A's costs are immediate and personal. The heating assistance cut is not an abstraction. It's this winter, it's your thermostat, it's your choice between warmth and food. The security benefit of Door A is real, but it arrives in a future you may not live long enough to fully experience. Door B keeps your heating assistance intact. The risks it carries are real, but they arrive later. For you, personally, the math looks different. If you're 35 years old with 2 kids and 30 years of working life ahead of you, the calculation shifts. Door A's costs hurt now, but the security gains arrive in a timeline that actually matters to you and your children. Door B's deferred risks aren't abstract. They're the world your kids will inherit. Same choice, different math, depending on where you stand in your own life. And that's before we even get to the geographic question. If you live in a city with high heating costs and depend on those assistance programs, Door A hits you directly and immediately. If you work in oil, in energy, in industries that live and die by the price of a barrel, Door A's promise of stabilized energy prices matters to you in ways it doesn't matter to someone who takes the subway to work. If you have a family member deployed in the Middle East right now, both doors look completely different than they do to someone watching from a safe distance. The same budget decision, landing differently, on different people, in different places, at different times in their lives. That's the real complexity of this choice. Not the geopolitics, not the military strategy, not the ideology. The timing and the distribution. Who pays now, who pays later, who gets protected first, who carries the risk longest. This isn't war or peace. It's a question of when the bill arrives and whose mailbox it lands in. So let's go back to the question we started with. Should we keep fighting in Iran? That question sounds like it's about strategy, about foreign policy, about what kind of country America wants to be on the world stage. But now you can see what it's actually about. It's about your heating bill this winter. It's about whether the education program your kid depends on is still running in September. It's about whether the small business loan you were counting on is still available. It's about whether the Medicare trajectory your retirement depends on stays stable or starts bending in the wrong direction. And it's also about whether Iran has a nuclear weapon in 2036. And whether your children face a larger version of this war when they're your age. And whether the Strait of Hormuz stays open or closes again the next time a negotiation falls apart. Both of those things are true at the same time. The domestic cost is real, and the security risk is real. And no amount of political framing makes one of them disappear. Here's the honest summary. Dora costs you now, in real, immediate, daily ways. The people who pay the most are the ones who can afford it least. The 74-year-old on fixed income, the single mother in Ohio, the factory worker 6 months from certification. They pay first, they pay heaviest, and the security benefit they're paying for arrives later if it arrives in a form that may or may not reach them personally. Door B protects you now. It keeps the programs running. It keeps the support systems intact. It lets people breathe, but it carries a risk that doesn't show up on any receipt, a deferred problem that grows quietly in the background and arrives later, heavier, and harder to solve. There is no option that costs nothing. There is no door that leads somewhere safe and free. Every choice in this situation has a price. The only question is when you pay it. And who pays it first? So here is the actual question. Not war or peace. Not strong or weak. Not hawk or dove. Do you want your Medicare spent on missiles or on hospitals? Do you want your heating assistance cut this winter so another fighter jet can fly? Do you want to protect your life today and carry the risk of a harder problem tomorrow? Or do you want to pay that price now, in your daily life, and buy a future where the problem is gone? There is no right answer that works for everyone. Because the answer depends on who you are, where you live, how old you are, what you can afford to lose right now, and what you can afford to face later. This is not a foreign policy debate. It never was. It's a question about whose life gets spent and when.